Today I want to talk about Summoner and how I beat insane roguelike difficulty with it. In the first part of the video, I'll go over all of Summoner's talents, and in the second part, I'll show you the character that I beat the game with, and go more in depth about leveling, Prodigy's gear, and so on. Summoner is a very easy to unlock class from the base game, and you might be surprised to see me talk about it, because in my tier list, I put it in F tier, with one of the biggest reasons being I absolutely hated its playstyle. But for some reason, I got the urge to play Summoner again, and I was quickly reminded why this class is so polarizing. It is the only class in the game where the correct playstyle is to never once even look at the enemy you are fighting. As the name of the class suggests, you summon things, but otherwise you are completely useless. You can't fight back or defend yourself if anything gets close, so most of the gameplay consists of just spamming your summons from around the corner. Summoner really tests how good your positioning is in Tome, as that is your primary layer of defense, which means it also, much more than any other class, discourages auto-exploring, because the difference between starting combat face to face with the enemy or with a summon around the corner is gigantic. But if you can get over all these little annoyances and you don't mind taking things slow and you survive the early game, Summoner is a surprisingly extremely powerful class, mostly because of this guy. So let's take a deep dive into its mechanics and find out why. As its resource, Summoner uses Equilibrium, which starts at 0 and goes up when you use your talents. As it gets higher than your willpower, it will start giving you a percentage chance to fail your talents, which is extremely annoying to deal with, but thankfully this is one of the classes that has the tools to try and avoid getting to that point. As we get to our first summon, let's talk about how Summoner's summons work in general. You scale your summons through mind power, and they also all copy the same stats from you, which you can see written in the description. The other hidden big way to scale them is through crit. Your mind critical chance gets checked when you summon, and if it passes, your summon's stats get scaled by your critical multiplier. You can only summon in range 5 around you, and there must be a clear path towards that tile, or the summon will simply appear randomly somewhere nearby. This can be a pain to deal with, since the majority of combat in Tome happens in closed areas, where you can't properly utilize your big army, because most of the summons can't attack if they are blocked by allies. You have a summon cap, which increases every 10 cunning, so for example, at 50 cunning, you can have 5 summons out at the same time. And finally, summons will follow you between zones, even through the overworld, so for example, you can summon in your fortress and then enter the first floor of Orc Prides with your summons ready to go. The Warhound is your basic melee dude. He just walks at you and auto-attacks and hits pretty hard, but he's also very squishy. This is the classic summon problem in Tales of Maj'Eyal, at least on higher difficulties. But later, in one of the locked trees, which is pretty much a must-take, you get Grand Arrival, a passive that makes every summon trigger a different effect when you create them, and these are very important for judging how good each summon is. The Warhound massively reduces physical resistance in a medium radius around it, and the reduction means it can also go into the negatives. So this is always a big damage multiplier. Physical damage is the most common on your summons, functions as an incredible AoE debuff that can also sometimes fight back. Jelly is one of the 2 summons that cannot move. It can use Jelly Spread, which does nature damage to enemies around it, but really the best use for it is to reduce your equilibrium by having it take damage. You can do that either by summoning it in the middle of enemies, or by damaging it yourself with talents like Nature's Equilibrium. Grand Arrival lets the jelly massively reduce nature resistance, which is alright, but the damage type importance goes physical first, then a big gap, and then fire and nature. The Minotaur has two talents worth talking about. Stunning Blow, which stuns, and that's good, and War Shout, which is a big cone that confuses anything in its path, which includes you if you are not careful. Basically this is Warhound 2.0 in terms of fighting capability. It is noticeably tankier, so it might survive a turn or two longer. Grand Arrival makes the Minotaur debuff enemy movement speed, which I value close to 0. If something is just trying to walk at you, you've pretty much already won that fight, and dashes or teleports don't care about movement speed. But despite this, with the physical resist reduction from Warhound, Minotaur is pretty good. Stone Golem can stun, and it has Unstoppable, which makes it invulnerable. This is Warhound 3.0. It still just walks at you, it still hits hard, but this time it literally cannot be killed, making it worth summoning even against the toughest, scariest enemies. Grand Arrival makes the Golem daze all enemies in radius, which is a weird debuff. It makes you unable to move and halves all of your stats, but any damage taken will remove it, so most of the time it feels like it does nothing, since you will have other summons attacking. Still, this is just a small bonus on a top tier summon that you should max. In summoning distance, really wish these were more imaginative, a Rich Flamespitter can Flamespit, which is a fire ranged attack. This guy can do a lot of fire damage, but is uber squishy, so any AoE effect will kill it very quickly. It also can't fire over allies, at least in its base version, so it's awkward to use early game and instantly dies late game. Grand Arrival makes it debuff fire resistance, which as I said is okay, but this is usually a low priority summon and there might not be any space left close enough to apply the debuff by the time you get to Flamespitter. Hydra has Acid, Poison and Lightning Breath, big AoE damage talents similar to Vermic. The problem is, if there is an ally in the way, it will not fire these breaths and just try to melee auto attack, which it's not particularly good at. So it is really awkward to use with any other summons. It's also only medium tanky, so it can get one shot. But the Hydra plays a crucial role in Summoner's early game, where you can open with it and give Hydra space to do its breaths. Grand Arrival makes the Hydra create a stacking poison ground effect, and this makes it worth casting, even if it will die instantly or won't be able to attack, because this can stack up to deal a decent amount of damage. Rimebark is the second immobile summon, and it has Winter's Fury, which does cold damage and freezes targets, including allies. This can completely lock down an enemy that is not stun immune, because that's the immunity that also makes you immune to freeze, but since you won't have stun immunity for a while either, it will also lock down all of your summons. Grand Arrival makes the Rimebark debuff cold resistance, so he is sort of a one-man army, doing it all by himself. He's also very tanky, but I personally struggled to fit him into my talent rotations. I would always rather cast one of the physical guys, who all synergize with each other. And Fire Drake is one of the best talents in the game. If you had the Drake fight against all the other summons at the same time, it would easily win. It is the tankiest summon, the highest damage summon, more or less the only summon that can attack through allies. It just does it all. It has Bellowing Roar from Vermic, which does mega AoE physical damage, and also applies a 50% confusion and scales with strength, and can easily one-shot most of the enemies you'll come across. And if that's not enough, it also has 3 fire damage talents, best one being Fire Breath, that also scales with its insanely high strength stat. The game feels like 5 times easier once you get to the Fire Drake, and it only gets stronger throughout the game. Grand Arrival makes small drake hatchlings appear alongside the big mama dragon, and they are fairly useless, but they take up space and potentially tank enemy hits. In 1x1 corridors they get pretty annoying, but generally you are happy to just have more stuff out there. Then there are 2 more summons hidden in utility. The turtle is your tank. It has Shell Shield, which gives it all resistance and taunt, which instant speed forces enemies to attack it. So even if you are about to get one shot by a rogue unique, you can put this down and you'll be safe. Unless the turtle and you get one shot in the same turn, but that shouldn't happen very often as it is very durable. I ultimately found this to be the best opener to make enemies waste all their powerful talents on it. It is important to remember that it only taunts every 5 turns, so if an enemy comes from around the corner, it could quickly kill the random warhound that it was aggroed by and then head right for you. So you should never feel too safe and still try to stay out of sight and ideally sort of insulate yourself from any melee enemy jumping you by always having summons in tiles surrounding you. Grand Arrival makes the turtle heal all allies on summon, which is fine. The spider knows Web to pin enemies and Spit Poison to spit poison at them. I found this to be the weakest of all the summons. There's just not much reason to summon this. It doesn't shoot through allies, so the fact that it's ranged is kind of meaningless. And Grand Arrival makes the spider pin surrounding enemies on summon, which can be situationally useful if your turtle dies and you need to keep something away from you for a couple turns. This can work, but I extremely rarely summoned the spider. Frantic Summoning is blinding speed, but it only works on summons, which is fine since that's all you can do. It even stops Equilibrium from messing with you, so yeah, you use this each combat to get like 5 summons out there in the first 2 turns, and you are very happy about it. The fact that it resets a cooldown of a summon can be very useful, but don't be greedy with it. There are situations like floor 1 entrances to Orc Prides where you should ignore this and just get your summons out quickly. Pheromones is an instant speed ranged and mark that makes all your summons focus the target and also makes it take increased damage. This is obviously good, but a bit less good than you think, since you can't use it if you never look at the enemy you are fighting. In Advanced Summoning there is Master Summoner, which is a sustain that reduces your summon cooldowns. You want to max this because the cooldown of Fire Drake is 10, so the 5th point gets it to 7 turns. Grand Arrival we already talked about, it's really good. Nature's Cycle reduces cooldowns of some abilities when you summon, and it's alright for 1 point, but if it was bugged and didn't work, I probably wouldn't notice. And Wild Summon empowers each of the summons in a different way. The most impactful ones, at least at first glance, are for the Hydra, which makes it possible for it to attack alongside your army, but it still gets one shot and it still can't shoot over allies. The Flame Spitter can though, so sometimes you can set it with surgical precision at range 10 to get a few attacks off, but in reality it's still usually just better to summon it melee range to debuff fire resistance so that Fire Drake can kill faster. Speaking of which, it gives it the ability to silence, which you probably don't need since Summoner really wants to go anti-magic. So mostly I use this for Minotaur so that it can dash from range, and Stone Golem because this arm ruins any weapon user. The description says each turn the chance diminishes and it goes down fast. First summon is 100%, but a turn later for me it went like 66%, then 33 and then 11. Honestly, I'm not even sure if this is worth the 9 equilibrium and the extra click. I doubt this changed the outcome of any combat in my playthrough. Augmentation has Rage, which passively gives stats when summons are killed. This will be on pretty much always, but it really doesn't give you much per point, so not much reason to invest into this. Detonate lets you blow up one of your summons for an effect in a huge AoE. Flame Spitter does fire damage and flame shocks, which is a stun, so pretty good, but if you summon it close enough to debuff fire resistance, it will very often not survive the turn for you to detonate it. A Hydra gives some very situational defensive stats. It looks decent, but in reality you just don't really ever need this. A Reinbark's Detonate is perfect for the ice summoner builds out there. You never want to blow up your fire drakes. Warhound is similar to Flame Spitter. It doesn't stun, but if it lives a turn, sometimes you'll blow it up to make space and deal some damage. Jelly is, I think, by far the best. You can summon it close to enemies, debuff their nature resist, and it will likely take some damage in that first turn, which will reduce your equilibrium, but it will survive, and then you can blow it up for damage and a massive slow for 3 turns. Another reason I like it better than Flame Spitter is because Minotaur and Stone Golem can already stun, and a lot of scary enemies are stun immune anyways, but slow always works, I think. Minotaur does confusion, but Flame Drake already does that at a higher strength. Stone Golem gives everything armor, but even with this you shouldn't be trying to tank enemies, and your summons are disposable. And the turtle gives all resist, and this is actually sometimes useful against mage type enemies with big AoEs in open space, because even if they get taunted, they will still hit you, so maxing out all your resistance can be the best way to deal with them. And Spider's Detonate sucks. Resilience makes your summons tankier and last longer. This is mostly for Fire Drake, since everything else will probably die by this point, but of course that is still very much worth it. Phase Summon is a range 10 swap with one of your summons, and the key here is that you do not need to see the summon to swap with it. If you click on a tile in range 10 and it has your summon on it, Phase Summon will just work. So this will save your life a couple of times during a run. The evasion is a nice bonus, but this is just an incredible one-pointer. Then there is combat techniques at 1.0 mastery, and it doesn't really fit with Summoner. You don't want to be rushing at enemies, you don't attack, and this unfortunately gives physical crit chance, not mind crit chance. You don't attack, and global speed is good, but you already have frantic summoning, so I think an extra inscription is better than this. For generic trees, there is survival, a heightened senses exists, device mastery lets you use your items more often, like your psionic shield for example, so that's good, and on Summoner you have a lot of extra generic points, so this is a valid option. Track is an amazing one-pointer, we all know this, but on Summoner I actually ended up maxing this. The reason for this is that you spent so much time behind walls with no information that it can be pretty dangerous. What if all your summons are dead and you also pulled the 2 uniques from the other room and they are about to jump you from around the corner? Information about enemies is vital in Tome, so I found it worth to invest the extra points here for the duration. And Danger Sense can be worth a point for the crit reduction. Call of the Wild has Meditation, which you can use for a bigger heal or to reduce your equilibrium, although you pay for that with 50% reduced damage. You are going to forget you turned this on and clear half a dungeon with it, don't worry, it's perfectly normal. Nature's Touch is the heal you can do, it can crit, so even at 1 point it's really big late game, and you can use it on Escorts, which is nice. Earth's Eyes I until now just called pretty much useless, but since Summoner is such a bizarre class and you spend so much time hiding, Earth's Eyes can actually be useful. You could live without it, but it's worth to keep on your hotbar, and I casted this way more than I thought I would. Nature's Balance can reset your Fire Drake, so it's worth a couple of points. Don't ask me what tiers are. Mindstar Mastery gives you Psyblades. This is a sustain that makes your Mindstars into extremely powerful melee weapons. If you don't plan on meleeing, this just gives you a bit more mind power and stats from your Mindstars, and you need to have this on to use all the following talents, like Thorn Grab, which is an instant speed melee slow, ideal to use before you run away with a movement infusion. Leaf's Tide creates a radius 3 AoE around you that quickly stacks up bleed on enemies, and it gives any ally, including you, a chance to completely ignore incoming damage. This has some sort of soft cap, around 50%, which means it's still really good. Nature's Equilibrium is great at reducing your equilibrium, although you do not want to get close enough to enemies for this, you just use it on your own summons. The Harmony tree starts out locked, but will get unlocked once you eat the heart of the Sandworm Queen. Waters of Life purifies poisons. Amazing, right? But this is only useful against poisons like Oozmencer's AoE poison that stacks up if you stand close to him, because all the poisons from rogues, which are the most common, have an extra effect, like giving you a chance to fail your talents, so the damage is not the problem with those. I personally also always run a healing infusion that cleanses diseases or poisons, so this talent is of no value to me. Elemental Harmony is usually bad, since you can't guarantee any of these effects happening, but the Fire Drake creates lingering ground fire damage everywhere, so in theory you could get this global speed every fight. The problem is, if you go anti-magic, which I think you should, the anti-magic shield will entirely block the small bits of fire damage and stop Elemental Harmony from triggering. One with Nature reduces the cooldown of your infusions, but not runes, and removes Infusion Saturation, which is the effect that increases infusion cooldown when you use multiple of them in short succession. Infusions are lifesavers, so I like this talent a lot. Healing Nexus redirects all direct healing in a big radius to you, and this is theoretically useful against some enemies that heal a lot, but from my experience, in practice you won't ever need this effect. The second part of this is that the heals are bigger and you get equilibrium reduced for each heal. This is an interesting combo with the heal on summon stat, which you can get on gear. You can summon multiple times per turn, so it's a good effect, but it's a question of opportunity cost. And not in terms of generic points, you can find those on Summoner, but in terms of modifiers on your gear. I didn't find the space for this, and didn't feel like it's necessary either. And as a last point, I won't go over all of the anti-magic talents here, they are the same as usual, and I'll talk about it a bit more in the build guide, but one talent that performs differently is Anti-Magic Zone. Usually this is only useful against mages, but on Summoner this is useful every fight for the equilibrium reduction per silenced target. It is common to have like 5 to 10 summons out there, so anytime you need to reduce your equilibrium, you just throw this at them. If you hit enemies as well, awesome, but mostly you just care about keeping your equilibrium in check. This has a short enough cooldown that it can perform this job very reliably, especially if you invest a couple of extra points for more equilibrium reduction. So here's my guy, straight from the final boss. For full transparency's sake, these are the add-ons that I use, none of them affect gameplay, it's just quality of life changes. As per usual, I've uploaded my entire playthrough of High Peak and the final boss without any commentary if you want to see how the class plays or how I did against the final boss. And we can get straight into it because I don't think there are really that many ways to build Summoner. Fire Drake is clearly the best one, so that's what you should build around. I went for Kornak as my race simply because I wanted both Augmentation, Advanced, I knew I want to go anti-magic and take Fungus, and I wanted my 5th Inscription. It also didn't seem like any of the races are that necessary. I imagine Drem has to be really good, being able to cast Fire Drake multiple times, but I feel like I played them every other character, so I went Kornak to spice it up. For the early game on Summoner, you want to be careful how you spend your stats, since you need willpower to be able to put points into your talents, and it gives you mind power. But you also need Cunning, because this increases the amount of summons you can get, and Summoner feels really bad until at least like 3 summons, so you should do your best to sort of spread the points around. If you find like a helmet that gives you +5 Cunning, you can spend a little less points on Cunning, and vice versa, but you can't just ignore Cunning, otherwise like playing with one summon is just not really doable. You should also get comfortable with just having points not invested anywhere, especially with generics. Since we are going Kornak, we're going to have many points, and a lot of the talents that we want to invest into are only going to be unlocked later, and there's not much reason to invest them. For example, we will eventually take Psyblades and go into Leaf's Tide, but this sustain is not going to be turned on for like 20-30 levels, so you might as well save the points for now. The first category point you want to spend on an inscription, and I recommend running 2 movement infusions, because what's going to happen is that as soon as something gets close, you will pop the movement infusion, run back, and then if it's like an Archmage or Paradox Mage type enemy, it sometimes will teleport next to you again, and on Summoner you just don't have the tools to survive that in the early game. So I think 2 movement infusions are a really important adaptation. By level 10, your tree should look something like this, with the Hydra being your go-to summon for every combat encounter. You could probably rely on the Hound instead, but since he's single target, I just think the Hydra is better, and on Kornak Summoner you will have so many class points that you can afford to just spend these 5 here, even though late game the Hydra is not that useful. The category point from level 10 you want to put into Summoning Advanced and start going into Master Summoner, so that you can transition into spamming as many Fire Drakes as possible, as soon as possible. If you don't find any items with Willpower or Cunning, this is roughly how the spread should look to get to those 3 maximum summons. This last class point you would ideally put into Frantic Summoning if you can find some gear with +2 Willpower, but you can also just save them so that you can take Stone Golem, Fire Drake and Pheromones on level 12. With the generics, it's the same story. If you find any Constitution gear, you can put it on and take thick skin. All resistance is always valuable on any character. By level 20, you should have your Fire Drake fully online. You should be running Master Summoner to reduce its cooldown a little bit, a couple points into Frantic Summoning to get your summons out faster, and you can always go Fire Drake, Frantic Summoning Fire Drake, which should deal with most of the enemies. The level 20 category point you can put into Augmentation and slowly start going into Face Summon. You want to get to this as fast as possible because this talent is a lifesaver, especially if you go into zones like Sandworm Lair. You also want to go anti-magic around level 20. I think I did it on level 19, and always the only enemy that should really be a challenge is the Orc Mage at the end, who has Bone Shield and a couple of nasty spells. But if you use the bits of cover, the little boulders in the arena, to break line of sight, your summons should eventually be able to deal with him. And then you can put a single point into all of these talents. You want 3 points in Resolve, because that gives you the bonus resistance to 3 elements, but you always want to make sure that the last generic point that you invest is this one, because on level 25 we will be taking Adept, which gives you 1.5 in all talents, and after that you only need 2 points in Resolve to get this bonus resistance to 3 elements. So let's say that I'll put a point into Danger Sense for the crit reduction, 2 points into Anti-Magic Zone for more equilibrium reduction, and then if I didn't want to invest the rest of these, I would put the last point here so that I'm ready to take it away after level 25. Also at this point I'm going to cheat my stats just to show what ideally you should aim for at this point. Let's say you have like maybe 2 points of thick skin. This will depend on the difficulty you play, how much Constitution gear you can find, and you want to put 1 point into heavy armor training, for which you will need some strength gear. just so you can wear heavy mail armor, gauntlets, helms and boots. You don't need to invest further because we are not going to be wearing heavy armor, and you don't need to invest in light armor training either, because fatigue doesn't matter, as equilibrium is not affected by fatigue, and we're not really going to be focusing on dodging attacks, but just avoiding them altogether and getting physical resistance to deal with any surprise ambushes. And just so we are not saving points, let's say you can max out track for more information and put the last point into resolve. You should actually have 2 more generic points if you completed the arena quest, so spend those as you wish. By level 30, you should max out Frantic Summoning for that last turn of duration. With Adept, you should have Master Summoner maxed out for that last turn of reduction on Fire Drake. 4 points in Grand Arrival give you most of the important bonuses, and Stone Golem should also be maxed out to help support the Fire Drake. For the generics, by level 30, you probably already ate the Heart of the Sandworm Queen, so you will unlock the Harmony Tree. Here you just go for One with Nature. 3 points get you the maximum out of this talent. You can put 2 points in Nature's Balance to try and refresh your Fire Drake. I didn't mention Anti-Magic Shield. By level 20, 30 Equilibrium is a pretty high cost, so it might not be worth it to run it, since it will just accelerate how fast your talents will start failing because of Equilibrium. But once you get Adept, this talent gets much better, and your willpower should be high enough that you can turn this on, and together with Resolve, this should make you very powerful against any non-physical or mind damage. So that's what you should focus on with your gear, as those will be the 2 most likely damage types to kill you. If you have something like a good Psionic Shield, you can max out Device Mastery. If not, you can put these points, spread them out in the anti-magic talents, since you are going to be using them a lot. I would still wait with Psyblades at this point and just focus on the rest of your talents. Your third stat should be Dexterity. This is always the decision if you want to go for some tankiness between Constitution and Dexterity. Constitution gives you more life, but it's really negligible amounts, and it gives you Healing Modifier, which can be useful especially since we are going to go Fungus and run a Regeneration Infusion. But Dexterity gives you crit damage reduction, which will almost always give you more HP than just going Constitution. And if you are going to die, it's usually the result of some crits. You continue improving your physical group of summons, getting Minotaur to 5 points. You can take Wild Summon at this point and experiment with it. Resilience at 4 points gives you the maximum lifetime, and I really like Detonate to get the range as big as possible so that I can always blow up the jelly. On the generic side, ideally you have Thick Skin maxed at this point, and with the category point from level 34, you should go into Fungus and max out Wild Growth, which should make it a lot more difficult to one-shot you and also give you some nice life regeneration. You don't need to rush in the other 2 talents, since you are only going to be running the Regeneration Infusion after coming back from the east and getting the last category point and the 5th Inscription. At least that's how I did it. And by the end of the game, you want to make sure all the summons that you use regularly are as powerful as possible, so you max out the Turtle and the Warhound. I also maxed out the Rich Flame Spitter, although I don't think I got much out of this. The Ooze can stay on 1 point, because it will be tanky enough to survive a turn or 2, and then you just detonate it anyways. Pheromones become much better at this point, because in the Orc Prides, and then on the final boss, there's not as much space to hide around, so it's easier to get this off. And then I ended up maxing Rage, even though these last few points here give me so little actual benefit. I still felt like it's better than these 2 summons that I never used. On the generics, you can max out Device Mastery by this point. You want to put points into Fungal Growth. You might not need to max it, it will depend on how much mind power you have. Sometimes you will get the same duration on 4 or 5 points, although the simplest way is to just be lazy and max it. And then finally, you put 5 points into Mindstar Mastery. It's worth waiting for this tree, because all of these talents get better later in the game, since they scale with your Mindstars. So for example, Leaf's Tide, if you take it at like level 20, it won't give you nearly as much chance to avoid damage, but by the end of the game, just 2 points should max out this chance. And similar with Nature's Equilibrium, you needed to deal some damage for the heal to be big enough to actually give you some equilibrium back. For the last stat, you invest into Constitution for some extra life and healing modifier, since you literally get 0 benefit from magic and strength. I think the best first Prodigy by a decent margin is Adept. I was looking on the Fire Drake on Dome Tips, and then I swapped the Tree Mastery to 1.6, which at 5 points is very similar to what taking Adept will give you, and it gives you an absolutely massive amount of stats. So this feels like the best way to scale your summons. And it's not only very powerful offensively, it of course also improves your defensive talents. I especially like it when going anti-magic, since it just makes all these talents feel a lot better. Then for the second Prodigy, I think you have a couple of options. I really wanted to make Through the Crowd work. It seems sort of tailor-made for summoners. I really like the swap effect with friendly creatures being much faster, because this is a potential danger if you need to run away, but then you are surrounded by your own summons. Swapping place with them does not use your movement speed, so that's a great bonus. The not being able to damage friends or neutral creatures I think is best if you heavily invest into Rhinebark, because then his AoE doesn't deal damage to friendlies, but it does not work on, for example, the Fire Drake's ground AoE. I think ground effects in Tome never count as coming from a target, they are just coming from that ground effect, so that will still hit you. Then 15% global speed is again like, it's alright, but it's not that much, and you don't really need it, since once you get all your summons out, you don't have much to do. And it's alright on some of your auto attackers, but really the decider for me were the all saves, because I imagined if I have 10 summons out, I'm going to get 100 to all saves, which then, with some support from gear, would allow you to really focus on saves and become immune to almost all debuffs. But unfortunately, these all saves are also capped to just 5 summons. At most you can get 50 to all saves, which doesn't really feel like enough. I couldn't justify it in the end. I thought about the serial form for the absolute damage resistance. It's always very good. The all damage penetration you will also utilize entirely, since your summons deal many different types of damage. And then the defense, I would then put at least a point into light armor training, and it would definitely be useful. But I didn't really want to save up magic gear. It's honestly my least favorite part of the game, saving up gear. Then I briefly thought about range amplification device to make my summons longer range, and you don't get affected by fatigue with equilibrium, so that downside doesn't exist. Unfortunately, I just don't think it's high impact enough to be useful. So in the end, I ended up with the most boring but consistent option of just getting 122 mind power. This is in practice fairly similar to Adept, as mind power scales basically all of your talents, so you get better offensively and defensively. You will not be taking advantage of the incoming disasters effect, because that only applies to damage that you do, and you don't deal any, it's all your summons. But I like this the best. I don't really think you need any of the defensive prodigies, since most of the debuffs should be tanked by your turtle. With the inscriptions, as I mentioned, I think 2 movement infusions are very important. I mean, the best way to understand it is to play summoner yourself and just wait for something to teleport close to you. You feel so incredibly vulnerable on this class. I think at least until like the Orc Prides, going 2 movement infusions is very good. And then for the final portion of the game, swapping one of the movements for your second wild, and then getting the regeneration infusion as your 5th inscription, I think is ideal. Adept applies to your inscriptions, so you can see these are absolutely nuts, giving me 57% all resistance. So if you get, let's say, Curse of Vulnerability applied to you and you can't cleanse it, you should still use a Wild Infusion and it will keep your resistances really high or even ideally kept out. With the Regen Infusions, you aim at the ones that have 12 turns of cooldown, because then what that means is that it can be up permanently and you are pretty hard to kill with this amount of life regeneration. With that being said, please do not ever autocast your Regeneration Infusion. I know this is sometimes recommended, but this is going to kill you. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. One perfect example is, let's say you are using a movement infusion to try and run away, and then this suddenly comes off cooldown, it automatically gets used, this cancels your movement infusion, then you press go to the left 2 more times before you realize, but you are already moving at normal speed, so you get hit in the back twice and you just died. So never autocast talents that take a turn. For combat, you basically have 2 approaches. Either you go Fire Drake, reset Fire Drake to try and kill the enemy as fast as possible, but I think this approach is not really necessary. Summoner absolutely excels at extended fights because you have an infinite resource, since every 12 turns you can just reset it to 0 with your anti-magic zone, and all your summons are low enough cooldown that you basically have an infinite army. So I like opening with the turtle into frantic summoning, then putting down, let's say, the dragon, minotaur, warhound to reduce fizz resist, war golem, the other turtle just to make sure all the enemies are taunted, and then with your last frantic summoning you can put down, let's say, the jelly, blow the jelly up and go from here. Of course, on gear you are looking for increased physical damage and physical damage penetration. Ideally you would still get this to 70, because even though you have Warhound that reduces physical resistance by a lot, 74% for me, sometimes enemies will just cleanse it, so it's still a good idea to cap your physical damage pen. Now, as I'll explain in a bit, I had a bit of a crisis with my items, so this is the best I could do, and you can make it work, but I would still aim for 70. Then by the late game, you also want to focus on crit chance and crit multiplier, since that also scales your summons, and even though you get a lot of mind power from your Prodigy, you still want to pick it up on gear whenever you can. This is a stat that you can never have enough of. For the defenses, you just really want to make sure you focus in on physical resistance. It is by far the easiest way to die, in general, but especially on anti-magic characters. And then mind also can be dangerous, especially if you feel like you are really tanky. Then you run into a solipsist and just get 2-3 shot because you have like 20% mind resist. Trust me, I've been there. Other than that, stun, confusion, immunity. This time it's not really as important for you, but it's important for your summons since they copy that. Immunities on summoner are actually less important than on the average character, since you tend to stay out of the way, and if your summons get stunned and confused, you just summon more of them. So I think I did 2 Orc Prides with like 20% stun immunity. I don't recommend it, but it's manageable. Other than that, you also really like Cunning on your gear, since that will scale your Master of Disasters, which gives you more mind power. With that being said, this item is still not very good. Now we come to the crisis that I talked about. I think I spent 18,000 gold on trying to roll a off the mountain modifier on either my head armor or my rope, because that is pretty much the perfect modifier for this type of character, getting physical damage and a lot of physical resistance. But after 18,000 gold, I still did not hit it. Obviously, once it got more and more expensive, I probably should have stopped, but I was determined at that point, so I just wasted all my gold, and that means that I had to run Deneth's neck guard to make sure my physical resist is high enough to not feel in danger. I had a really nice necklace with like crit multi and all kinds of nice stats, but I felt like the only way I die is to physical damage. For my cloak, I actually ran this because I needed it for the last bit of stun immunity. Yes, it's a tier 1 cloak that I found in Trollmire, but then in High Peak I found this, which is much better. Spellhunt remnants are really nice if you can find them. The belt is a good place to pick up some mild crit. On my boots I just have a bit of physical damage and a bit of crit multi, a really below average psionic shield, a pretty below average lantern, giving me what, like 3% all resist, and some of these less important immunities. I also couldn't find any Voratun random uniques, and then I dropped 4 of them in the last Orc Pride that I did, so I was thankfully able to fix my stun immunity, or at least most of it, through these rings. Yeah, this cursed rope I don't even want to look at. It could have been so much better. And then I spent the last bits of points on my Mindstars. You should keep in mind the Psyblade sustain, which multiplies your mind power, willpower and cunning, so those stats are of higher value. Another funny thing is that there are 2 very similar physical modifiers on Mindstars. One of them is just a lot worse, and of course that's the one that I managed to roll, but at that point I was already resigned to just taking whatever I can get, and yeah, this other Mindstar is pretty nice, giving me a decent amount of crit multi and some more cunning. But in general it's pretty disappointing. I feel like I'm at like 60% of my power. If I got the physical damage increase to like 150%, crit multi to like 250, I really want to see how far I can push the Fire Drake. I mean, it's already really good. It can 1v1 basically any rare. You can see it has over 8,000 health, so it just doesn't die, even if it doesn't have many resistances. And if we look at the talents, Bellowing Roar, 1000 physical damage, Fire Breath, 2500 fire damage, and then Devouring Flames don't deal a lot of damage, but 10% of the damage will heal the Fire Drake, and since you have so many other summons around that will be constantly taking the damage from the Fire Drake's AoE, he just doesn't die, ever. For the Escorts, picking talents is more valuable than usual, since we're going to have Adept, and this applies to them. So for example, usually on Tinker Escorts, the classic choice is between 5 Cunning or Last Engineer Standing, which gives you only 2 Cunning, but a small reduction to critical hits. With Adept, this choice is obvious because it gives you 5 Cunning plus the reduction to critical hits. Then also picked up Misdirection from a Thief Escort for a 23% chance to dodge physical debuffs. And Unflinching Resolve I really like with Adept because it makes it possible to target blinds, and this has been very useful throughout my run when I either didn't want to or couldn't waste an inscription. Other than that, you try to take Cunning. If you can't take Cunning, you take Willpower. For the elixirs, I would go class points into generic points into +3 Cunning and Dexterity, and yeah, that's it. This is my formal apology to all the Summoner enjoyers out there. Clearly, Summoner is not one of the weakest classes in Tales of Maj'Eyal. Fire Drake makes sure of that, and I actually enjoyed my playthrough. It was definitely my longest playthrough, and I did have to play, I'd say, in shorter bursts because the playstyle does get tedious faster than other classes, and I knew while playing it that I am probably never going to play Summoner again, so I hoped I wasn't going to die. But despite what it might sound like, I did enjoy the playthrough. I originally intended to make a video about Marauder and to follow along with that character and talk about the item progression and why I choose certain items at different points of the game, but I really wasn't having fun playing Marauder, and I tried to force myself through it, and then I died in a really stupid way in the Sandworm Lair, and I just burnt out really hard on Tome. I've already learned this lesson once on Sun Paladin, but clearly I had to learn it again. Turns out playing games when you are not having fun is just not very smart, so yeah, I still want to make those sort of more educational type videos about Tome, but it will happen when it happens. I plan on making more videos about other games, but don't worry, there are still many classes that I want to explore in Tales of Maj'Eyal, and I plan on documenting that through these types of videos. So I hope you have fun spamming fire drakes, and thank you for watching.